My brother sold our family home without telling me, so I bought it back and kicked him out. I thought I'd never have to fight my own brother for something as precious as our childhood home. But when he secretly sold it out from under me, without even giving me a heads up, I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. What followed was one of the most stressful, bizarre, and, frankly, satisfying experiences of my life. Let me tell you how I bought back my family home and kicked him out. Part 1. The Bombshell. Let me set the stage. Our family home wasn't just some random house. It was the house. You know what I mean? It was where my brother and I grew up, where we celebrated birthdays, had family game nights, and dealt with life's ups and downs. It wasn't a mansion or anything. It was a cozy two-story house with a big oak tree in the front yard that we used to climb as kids. My mom planted her favorite roses along the fence, and my dad built a deck out back where we'd have barbecues every summer. It was home. After our parents passed away a few years ago, my dad first, then my mom, it was just me and my brother Jake. Mom and Dad left the house to both of us, split evenly. I wasn't in a rush to do anything with it. I figured Jake felt the same way. He told me he wasn't ready to make any big decisions, and honestly, I was fine with leaving things as they were. Fast forward to a couple of months ago, I was out of town for work, staying in a hotel after a long day of meetings, when I got a text from a random number. It read, "Hi, just wanted to confirm our move-in date for the house. Let me know if this weekend works for the keys." At first, I thought it was a wrong number. What house? What move-in date? But the area code was local, so I replied, "Sorry, I think you have the wrong person." The next message made my stomach drop. Jake said this was the number to reach about the old family home on Oak Street. My partner and I are super excited to move in. I stared at my phone for a solid minute, trying to process what I'd just read. Our family home, Oak Street, Jake told them to reach out. It didn't make any sense. I felt like I was in some alternate reality. I immediately called Jake. No response. I texted him. Nothing. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed again. "Sorry, I don't mean to bother you. Just need to know when the lease starts. Let me know when Jake's available to finalize." Lease? Lease? I was furious. I didn't even know where to start. I called Jake again, this time leaving a voicemail that was probably less calm than I'd like to admit. "Jake, what the hell is going on? Did you do something with the house without telling me? Call me back. Now." Spoiler. He didn't call back. When I finally got home a few days later, I went straight to Oak Street. And guess what? A for sale sign with a sold sticker on it was sitting in the front yard like it owned the place. Part 2. The Ugly Truth. I couldn't believe my eyes. There it was, the house we grew up in, sold without a word to me. I felt a mix of disbelief and rage bubbling up. I took a deep breath, pulled my phone out, and called Jake for the 100th time. Straight to voicemail again. I was ready to storm over to his place, but I figured I needed answers before I confronted him. So I called the number on the sold sticker, pretending to be a curious neighbor. A friendly voice answered, and I asked if they could tell me about the sale. They said the buyers were a lovely couple who just finalized everything a few days ago. The voice on the other end even gushed about how smooth the process had been. Jake was really easy to work with, they said. He seemed eager to close quickly, which made things move along faster. Eager to close quickly? That phrase hit me like a ton of bricks. I hung up, shaking. Jake had gone behind my back, and from the sound of it, he'd been rushing to get the house sold. I knew I had to get to the bottom of this, so I called a lawyer friend of mine, Natalie, and explained everything. "Hold up," she said. "The house was in both your names, right? He legally can't sell it without your consent unless—" She trailed off. And I already knew what she was about to say. Unless Jake forged my signature. My stomach churned. I'd known Jake to be impulsive, even selfish at times. But this was next level. Natalie told me to pull all the paperwork I could find and meet her at her office. The next day, I went digging through my files at home, looking for anything related to the house. The deed, the will, any correspondence from our parents' lawyer. Sure enough, everything listed both Jake and me as co-owners. It was ironclad. I was furious but also determined to fix this. When I met with Natalie, she confirmed my worst fear. "If he sold it without your approval, that's fraud," she said. "We'll need to act fast if we're going to reverse this. Do you have any way to contact the buyers?" Thankfully, I still had the number from that earlier text conversation. Natalie took it from there, promising to reach out and explain the situation to the buyers. Meanwhile, I had one thing on my mind: confronting Jake. I drove straight to his apartment, practically vibrating with anger. When he opened the door, looking way too casual for someone who just ruined my week, I let him have it. "What the hell, Jake? You sold the house, our house, without telling me?" His face immediately went pale. He stammered for a second before trying to play it cool. "Look, I was going to tell you, okay? But you've been so busy and it was just easier this way." "Easier?" I shouted. "You forged my signature, Jake. Do you even realize how illegal that is?" He shrugged, which only made me angrier. "I needed the money, all right? I'm in a tight spot and I thought—" "You thought what? That I wouldn't notice? That I'd just let you sell the one thing we had left of Mom and Dad?" For the first time, he looked a little ashamed, but it didn't last long. He quickly shifted to defensiveness. "It's just a house. You're acting like it's the end of the world." That was the moment I realized just how little he cared about what that house meant to me or to us. Part 3. Taking Action. I left Jake's apartment that day with a head full of steam and a heart full of determination. He could shrug it off all he wanted, but this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As soon as I got back home, I called Natalie to update her on the situation. "Let me guess," she said, already sounding exasperated. "He admitted it but tried to justify it, right?" "Pretty much," I said. "What's next? Can we stop this sale?" Natalie was already on it. She'd contacted the buyers and explained that there might be an issue with the transaction. They were understandably upset but willing to cooperate. After all, the last thing they wanted was to get tangled up in a legal mess. The next step was filing a formal complaint. Natalie drafted the necessary paperwork, and I went to sign it the next day. I felt a mix of hope and anxiety as I handed it over. We were essentially freezing the sale until everything could be sorted out. Meanwhile, Jake was radio silent. No texts, no calls, nothing. It was like he was pretending the whole thing wasn't happening. I figured he was either panicking or trying to come up with some excuse to make himself look like the victim. While we waited for the legal process to move forward, I decided to dig a little deeper into Jake's tight spot. I wasn't exactly keen on prying into his personal life, but after what he did, I figured I had every right. I reached out to a mutual friend, Kevin, who's known both of us since high school. "Do you know what's going on with Jake?" I asked. Kevin hesitated before answering. "Yeah. He's been in some trouble lately, gambling, mostly. I heard he's racked up a pretty big debt." It felt like a punch to the gut. Gambling? Debt? This wasn't the Jake I grew up with. Sure, he'd always been a little reckless, but this was on another level. Kevin sighed. "I think he's been borrowing money from all over, trying to keep his head above water. If he sold the house, it was probably to pay someone off." It was starting to make sense now, not that it justified anything. Jake had backed himself into a corner, and instead of coming to me for help, he'd taken the easy way out. The illegal way out. The thought made my blood boil all over again, but I tried to focus on the task at hand. Natalie called a few days later with good news. The sale was officially on hold, and we had a court date set to sort everything out. "We've got a solid case," she said. "The buyers are willing to testify that they didn't know anything was wrong, and the paperwork shows clear signs of forgery. It's just a matter of time." That was a relief, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. I wanted to confront him again. Not just about the house, but about everything. What was he thinking? Why didn't he come to me? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do if the court ruled in my favor? Part 4. The Courtroom Drama. The day of the court hearing came faster than I expected, but not fast enough for my nerves. Natalie had prepped me well, but I was still dreading the thought of seeing Jake there. Part of me hoped he'd show up with some kind of apology or explanation, but the more realistic part of me knew better. When I walked into the courtroom, I saw Jake sitting at the defendant's table. He looked exhausted, disheveled even, but he didn't make eye contact with me. Instead, he stared straight ahead, avoiding any acknowledgement of my presence. Typical. The hearing started with Natalie presenting our case. She laid it all out. How the house was co-owned, how Jake forged my signature, and how the sale was completed without my consent. She even pointed out discrepancies in the paperwork, like how my signature looked different from how I normally sign my name. The buyers also testified, confirming that they'd had no idea there was any conflict over the property. They were polite but firm, clearly not thrilled about being dragged into the middle of a family feud. Then it was Jake's turn. His lawyer tried to spin some sob story about how Jake was in financial trouble and thought he had my implied consent to sell the house. I nearly laughed out loud at that one. Implied consent? Give me a break. When Jake finally spoke, he looked like a deer in headlights. I didn't mean for it to get this far, he mumbled. I thought I could fix things before anyone found out. The judge wasn't buying it. Fix things? By committing fraud against your own sibling? Jake didn't have an answer. He just stared at the table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. After what felt like an eternity, the judge ruled in my favor. The sale was nullified, the property would revert back to both of us as co-owners, and Jake was ordered to cover all legal fees. It was a huge relief, but the victory felt bittersweet. I'd gotten the house back, but my relationship with Jake was in tatters. As we left the courtroom, I caught up to him in the hallway. "Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "why didn't you just tell me? We could have worked something out." He finally looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of regret. But then he shrugged, as if to say it didn't matter anymore. "I didn't think you'd understand," he muttered before walking away. Part 5. Picking up the pieces. After the court hearing, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered. Sure, I'd won the legal battle, but it felt like I'd lost something far more important. My brother. The first thing I did was visit the house. I needed to see it again, not as a piece of property or the subject of a courtroom fight, but as the home I remembered. Walking through the front door felt surreal. It still smelled faintly like Mom's favorite lavender air freshener, and the scuffs on the hardwood floor from years of wear and tear were exactly where I remembered them. But it wasn't the same. The sold sign was gone, and so were the signs of life that used to make it feel warm. No family photos, no cozy furniture, no laughter echoing through the halls. It was just empty. I spent hours walking from room to room, reliving old memories. The kitchen, where Mom used to bake her famous chocolate chip cookies. The living room, where Dad would fall asleep during Sunday football games. The backyard, where Jake and I would race each other to the treehouse. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Jake's betrayal ruin what this house meant to me, or to our family. I was going to buy him out of his share and take full ownership. It was the only way I could truly feel at peace. The next morning, I called Natalie to ask how to make it happen. She explained the process and estimated how much it would cost, based on the house's current market value. It wasn't going to be cheap, but I'd saved enough over the years to make it work. When I reached out to Jake to propose the buyout, I expected resistance, or at least some snarky comment. But to my surprise, he agreed almost immediately. "Fine," he said over the phone. "Take it. I don't want anything to do with it anymore." His tone was flat, almost resigned. I wanted to press him for more, to ask why he was giving up so easily. But I didn't. Maybe he was tired of fighting, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. Either way, I wasn't about to let the opportunity slip away. The paperwork took a few weeks to finalize, but once it was done, the house was officially mine. It was a strange feeling, bittersweet, but also empowering. Part 6. Making it mine again. Owning the house outright felt like a fresh start, but it also came with a heavy responsibility. It wasn't just about paying the mortgage or keeping the lights on. It was about restoring the heart of the home. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement about the future. The first thing I did was take a week off work to focus entirely on the house. I rolled up my sleeves, grabbed some cleaning supplies, and got to work. It was a daunting task. Years of neglect had left the place dusty and dingy, but with every surface I scrubbed and every corner I swept, it started to feel a little more like home again. I decided to keep some of the old furniture that Mom and Dad had left behind. Their worn-out recliner and scratched coffee table might not have been worth much, but they were priceless to me. I also found a box of family photos tucked away in the attic. Seeing those smiling faces from birthdays and holidays past was like a balm for my soul. But I didn't stop there. I wanted to breathe new life into the house while honoring its history. I painted the walls a warm, inviting color, replaced the outdated curtains, and splurged on a new sectional for the living room. I even started a small garden in the backyard, planting a mix of flowers and vegetables like Mom used to do. During this process, I couldn't help but think about Jake. Every brushstroke and hammer swing brought back memories of us as kids. Sneaking cookies before dinner, building forts in the living room, arguing over who got the bigger slice of pie. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the person he had become. One day, while I was unpacking boxes, I came across an old board game we used to play together. Risk. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Jake had always been ruthless during our games, conquering territories and plotting his next move with a gleam in his eye. Maybe that should have been my first clue, but then I found something else. A photo of the two of us as kids, standing in front of the house with our arms slung around each other. We couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. I stared at it for a long time, wondering how we drifted so far apart. I didn't know if Jake and I would ever fix things, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let his mistakes define this house, or my memories of it. Part 7. The Unexpected Visit. A few weeks after the house was finally mine, I was settling into my new routine. I'd started spending more evenings on the back deck, sipping tea and watching the sun dip behind the oak tree. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I was shocked to see Jake standing there. He looked rough. Messy hair, dark circles under his eyes, and a weary expression that made him look older than he was. "Hey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, but another part of me, maybe the part that still saw him as my little brother, hesitated. "What do you want, Jake?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He sighed, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him in. He glanced around the house, taking in the changes I'd made. "It looks good," he said. "You've done a nice job." I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall. "Cut to the chase, Jake. What do you want?" He sank onto the couch, rubbing his hands together nervously. "Look, I know I messed up. I know I screwed you over, and I'm sorry. I really am." I raised an eyebrow. "You're sorry? That's it?" "No, it's not just that," he said quickly. "I want to explain, not to make excuses, but so you understand. I was desperate. The people I owed money to, they weren't the kind of people you can just ask for more time. I thought selling the house would solve everything, but it only made things worse. I wanted to be angry. I was angry. But seeing him like this made it hard to hold on to that anger. He looked broken, like a man who'd hit rock bottom and didn't know how to climb back up. "What do you expect me to do about it now?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "I don't expect anything," he said. I don't have anywhere else to go. I was hoping, just for a little while, I could crash here." I stared at him, my emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to tell him to get lost, to remind him of what he'd done and how he didn't deserve my help. But another part of me couldn't ignore the fact that he was my brother, and he was clearly in trouble. "Why should I trust you?" I asked finally. He looked up at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Because I don't have anyone else to trust me." Part 8. Terms and Conditions. Jake's words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I stared at him, trying to decide if this was another manipulation or if he was finally being honest. The memories of his betrayal were still fresh, but so were the echoes of our childhood. After a long pause, I sighed. "All right, Jake, you can stay. But it's not going to be a free ride. There are conditions." Relief washed over his face, but I held up a hand before he could say anything. "First, you're going to pay me back. Every dime you made from that sale, I want it. I don't care how long it takes, but you're not walking away from this without consequences." He nodded quickly. "Yeah, of course. I'll pay you back. I swear." "Second," I continued, "you're going to get your act together. That means no gambling, no shady deals, no lying. If I catch you doing anything sketchy, you're out. No second chances." "I understand," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes. I mean it." "Third, and this one's non-negotiable, you're going to get help. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need to figure out why you keep sabotaging yourself. I'll even help you find someone, but you have to actually go." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, if that's what it takes, I'll do it." I didn't know if I fully believed him, but it was the best offer he was going to get. "You can have the guest room," I said, "but don't make me regret this, Jake. I mean it." "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I won't let you down this time. The first few days of Jake living in the house were tense, to say the least. We barely spoke to each other, and when we did, it was short and to the point. He kept to himself most of the time, which I appreciated. I wasn't ready to play happy families just yet. But over time, I started to notice small changes. He cleaned up after himself, offered to help with chores, and even cooked dinner a couple of times. He still had a long way to go, but it was a start. One evening he came into the living room where I was watching TV and sat down awkwardly on the edge of the couch. I've been looking for jobs, he said. It's slow going, but I've got a couple of interviews lined up. That's good, I said, trying not to sound too encouraging. I wasn't ready to let my guard down just yet. I found a therapist, he added. My first appointment's next week. I turned to look at him, surprised. Really? Yeah, he said, nodding. You were right. I need to figure my stuff out. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jake was finally ready to change. Part 9. Building Bridges. As the weeks went on, Jake started showing signs of real improvement. He landed a part-time job at a local hardware store. Not glamorous, but it was steady work. He also kept up with therapy, and though he didn't talk much about what they discussed, I could tell it was having an impact. It was strange, living with him again after everything that had happened. There were moments when the anger and resentment bubbled up, but I tried to focus on the progress he was making. Slowly, the walls between us began to come down. One evening, we were sitting on the back deck, watching the sun set behind the oak tree. Jake broke the silence first. You know, I used to hate this tree, he said with a small laugh. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. Because you always climbed it better than me, he said, smirking. I'd get halfway up and freeze, and you'd be at the top, waving down at me like it was nothing. I couldn't help but laugh at the memory. You were scared of heights. That's not my fault. Yeah, well, you didn't have to rub it in, he said, but his tone was light. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were just two siblings hanging out, not two people locked in a battle of betrayal and forgiveness. The next day, I was cleaning out the attic when I came across another box of old photos and mementos. Inside was a journal Mom had kept, a mix of recipes, gardening tips, and little notes about her days. As I flipped through it, I found an entry about me and Jake. It was short, but sweet. Jake and me spent the afternoon building a treehouse in the oak. It's crooked, and they argued the whole time, but I've never seen them laugh so much. I hope they always look out for each other like this. I felt a lump in my throat as I read her words. Mom had always believed in us, even when we didn't believe in ourselves. That evening, I showed the journal to Jake. He read the entry silently, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me. Do you think she'd be disappointed in me? He asked softly. I shook my head. I think she'd be proud that you were trying to make things right, and so am I. For the first time, Jake smiled, a real, genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Part 10. A New Beginning. Months passed, and little by little, life began to feel normal again, or at least a new version of normal. Jake continued to work hard at his job, and he even started saving up to pay me back. He wasn't there yet, but he was making steady progress. One day, he surprised me by handing me an envelope with a few $100s inside. It's not much, he said, but it's a start. I'll keep chipping away at it. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time, I believed him. Thanks, Jake, I said, taking the envelope. It means a lot. Beyond the money, I noticed a real change in him. He was more responsible, more thoughtful. He even started helping out with the garden, something he used to complain about endlessly when we were kids. Our conversations grew easier, too. We started sharing meals together, talking about our day, and even joking around like we used to. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension and lingering resentment, but it was progress. One weekend, I decided it was time to tackle the old treehouse in the backyard. It had fallen into disrepair over the years, and I thought it would be a fun project to bring it back to life. When I mentioned it to Jake, he surprised me by offering to help. Are you sure? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You hated that thing when we were kids. Yeah, well, he said with a smirk, I've got some unfinished business with that tree. We spent the whole weekend working on it, hammering nails, replacing boards, and adding a fresh coat of paint. By the end of it, the treehouse looked better than ever. As we sat in the treehouse, admiring our handiwork, Jake turned to me. "Thanks for giving me a second chance," he said. "I know I didn't deserve it, but I'm really glad you did." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "You're my brother, Jake. That doesn't mean I'll let you walk all over me, but it does mean I'll always give you a chance to make things right." He smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like we were truly on the same page. That night, as I looked out the window at the house and the treehouse glowing softly in the moonlight, I realized something important. The house wasn't just a piece of property or a collection of memories. It was a reminder of where we came from and who we could be. It had survived storms, arguments, and even betrayal, and it still stood strong, just like our family. That's the story of how my brother sold our family home without telling me, and how I fought to get it back. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't pretty, but it taught me a lot about forgiveness, family, and standing up for what matters. If you've made it this far, thanks for sticking around. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to deal with the family drama like this? How did you handle it? Share your stories in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more crazy life tales like this one. Remember, no matter how messy things get, there's always a chance to rebuild. You just have to be willing to put in the work. See you in the next video.